Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Encourage Mindset. I'm your host, Ethan Vandehyve. Today, I have Patrick Coggins along with me today, and he's going to be diving into a variety of topics because he is a businessman, it sounds like. He's got an entrepreneurial spirit, and he also really cares about mindset and motivation as well. So that's why I'm really excited to have him on as a guest. But first off, every time I have a guest, I want to get to know them on a little bit deeper level, get to know their story. And Patrick, our audience and myself is interested about your story. So why don't you tell us a little bit more about who you are and how you came to what you are today?
Absolutely. First of all, Ethan, thank you for having me. Much appreciated. Love the podcast and privileged to be a guest. So thank you. So I'm an entrepreneur today, but certainly that wasn't always the case. So I went to school initially for business. I actually had a love for music growing up. I was a drummer, percussionist, etc., and was bit by the bug of wanting to be on stage and play music. But I always did great in school. I always over-indexed in school. It was the thing that was always great for me, right? So I went to school, got a degree in business, and I was about one class short of minoring in jazz music. And
wow.
Yes. Very, very interesting dichotomy between these two, crafts, right? And ultimately, had a lot of great opportunities with music. I ended up touring Texas behind an up-and-coming rapper. Ended up playing, cutting a bunch of records. I did a lot of great things. It was so much fun. But some of those experiences taught me, a few years later that I didn't really want to be a professional musician in that way, at least not the musician that toured, right? I mean, it's a tough life. Any traveling musician will tell you that. It's a very different life. And so I ended up getting a business degree. And ultimately, as part of business, you end up learning a lot about accounting, right? And so I ended up going into public accounting right after school and a small CPA firm in the Bay Area here in Northern California. And, at this point, however, still, in my early 20s, I was still bent on wanting to pursue music. So I moved to Los Angeles with my bandmates at the time. And I ended up getting interviewed by a staffing agency that specializes in placing accountants. And at the time, I had no idea these staffing agencies even exist, right? They interviewed me for a role for one of their clients. I was looking for an accountant. And I figured, look, this would be a great way for me to kind of pay the bills, right, while I pursue my profession in music. And ultimately they said, hey, wait a minute. They had an epiphany. They said, you would be a great salesman for us. We should hire you as an account executive. And so they sort of flipped the script on me. They said, why don't you come be a salesperson for us? And I said, wait a minute. I don't know sales. I've never done sales in my life. My father, for a period of time, for years did sales. He used to do door-to-door sales. I called him and he said, don't do it. That, as soon as you underperform, they just cut you, right? Don't do it. I thought about it for a moment. I said, you know what? I may not be a salesman, but, I knew I wanted to make a lot of money. I said, let me give this a try, right? I mean, I wasn't married to the idea of doing accounting. So I gave it a try. And fortunately for me, it worked out really well. And so, I had a lot of success in the initial 3 years. And so much so that the person who ran the office, the branch manager at the time, promoted me to become the manager. And now this inflection point is kind of what dovetails a little bit more into kind of my story around kind of leadership, right? Because, I'm at a point now in my career where I've started my own company many years later, 20 years later, that is. And I've realized that I was not operating from a vantage point of having really truly understood what it meant to be a leader. Okay. So, in 2008, I was promoted for the very first time in a role to manage people, right? And some of those people were twice my age. I was 24 years old at the time. And I was given the keys to management. I had no idea what I was doing. I had virtually no training on what it was like to be a leader or a manager of people. And I fell a lot. And I'll tell you what else happened, during 2008 was the global recession, right? We had, the stock market plummeted through the floor. Businesses, went under overnight, and it was horrific, right? If you were in the workforce at that time. The industry that I work in, we place accountants for a living, okay? Companies, when they lose accountants at the corporate level, whether they work in finance or accounting, or they do SEC reporting, or they're CFOs, when they lose people, they come to us and say, can you help us find somebody? We need a replacement. We might need that replacement on a short-term basis, or we might need you to go kind of headhunt somebody for us on a long-term basis, right? And we'll pay you a fee for that. So that's the industry I grew up in. The challenge with that business is it follows the health of the job market, right? So when the job market is not doing well, companies don't have an appetite to hire and they don't have a budget to pay a third-party service to help them hire, then we're sort of hung out dry for a period of time, right? So we have a very kind of cyclical economic business. So in 2008, when the economy fell through the floor, I had to lay off half my staff, and half my staff were twice my age, and I had no training as a leader, let alone any skill set at my disposal to teach me the words that I should say and how to comfort somebody that was twice my age, had a family, how I was going to relieve them of their position, right? And so, then I eventually moved on from that company, and I went to go work for a company that was similar and had a great reputation in the business. But that company had no clarity, no mission statement, no vision statement. They had a mission statement, but nobody could tell you what it was. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And again, no training around leadership whatsoever. Okay. And then eventually I realized, you know what? Why don't I just do this myself? Right. This business, the actual business itself, at least at the time, I thought this is not a difficult business. I can open up my own firm. I could keep the margin. Right. And so I had the hubris and the audacity to go do that in 2019. So we started a company called CFO's Domain with my partner. And we were driven by the motivation to kind of start over with a blank sheet of paper and how we wanted to build something unique and special, right? And what we wanted to do there. And so now we have two offerings. We help people find life-changing career opportunities in the finance profession, and we help folks that are in transition, identify short-term interim opportunities, right? That can help them kind of pay the bills, but add additional skill sets to their sort of, their current skills, right? What they have presently. What I realized, Ethan, we're 6 years into this company now, right? If we round up, we're 6 years in this year, which is really exciting because, by the way, small businesses statistically don't really make it past 5 years. They just don't, right? So now we made it past the 5-year mark, which is a big deal for us. But I realized about 3 years into our entrepreneurial journey here that our culture was suffering, okay? Because, as any startup will tell you, right? I mean, it's, path to profitability, grow, scale, you're working hard, right? There's not a lot of room to think intentionally about culture and how you treat people and how you're thoughtful about how you kind of weave that into the company, right? And how you grow that. And so I realized very quickly that, we were kind of putting the cart before the horse, so to speak, in terms of what did we really want to be about as a company? How are we going to treat our employees? How are we going to upskill them? How are we going to hold them accountable? How are we going to give them candid feedback so that we can not only get the most out of them, but that they can support us, we can support them, right? What does that look like in terms of our employees? And so that sent me down this path of sort of, a deep dive into kind of the tenets of leadership, And here's the thing about leadership and culture is some people will listen to this and kind of roll their eyes because there's a lot that's been said on the topic, right? And you just Google leadership, 15 timeless principles of leadership. There's just been so much said on the topic. But if you actually look at the data, right? So Gallup is a world-renowned global consultancy for human capital, right? And some of your listeners may have heard of it. In 2024, only, I think it was 30% of employees surveyed from a large swath of companies and, globally, only 30% of employees were actually engaged at work. That means 70%, think about that, 70% of people who work today in jobs are disengaged. They're not engaged at work, meaning that they don't trust leadership. And that's a huge statistic, right? So there's a breakdown between what everybody's talking about and what everybody's saying is important in the market and what's actually finding its way into the corporate sort of offices, right? Where business is actually occurring, things are getting executed, things are getting done. There's a huge disparity between these two things, right? And then when you think about what's coming in terms of the labor market, we think about what's happening with technology and AI and depending upon where you sit in terms of, is it going to have is it going to be a boon for jobs or is it going to obviously eliminate a lot of jobs? It's going to have a huge impact here, and you're going to need leadership to help navigate that transition. So it's a topic that I'm obsessed with. I've been obsessed with for the last 3 years, And I find that the more I apply these things, the better our business becomes for it.
Yeah, no, that's some excellent points, and I totally agree with you that obviously employee morale, employee satisfaction, customer satisfaction, all of those things are really important because those are the core things that hold a business together. So that's awesome that you've been able to have a small business more than 5 years. So kudos to you on that. So diving into some questions here, obviously I want to pick your brain because you're very intelligent in some subjects, and maybe you can dive more into this leadership category too. But behind you, I've noticed either you're an avid reader or you just, like you said, love to learn. So what's something from a book behind you that you've learned, to help you grow as an entrepreneurial or as like just somebody wanting to learn a lot?
Yeah, well, I'll tell you, don't be fooled. There's about a quarter of those books I haven't gotten to quite yet, right? So, it's I love reading and I love books, and it's hard to find the time to get to them all today. So there's a book on my desk that I'm staring at that's been really important for me. So it's got kind of an odd name. It's called Nonviolent Communication, and it's got an odd title. But what I'll tell you is it's changed my life relative to how you resolve conflict in the workplace. Okay. So it turns out that most conflict, different varying degrees of disagreement or debate between, two employees or a leader and an employee, et cetera, within work, it happens. These things get out of control because one party simply isn't feeling understood or heard, right? It sounds really simple to hear, but when you have so much conviction behind your point of view and your opinion, it's really easy to forget that it doesn't matter what you believe if you can't affect change, onto somebody else, if you can't influence somebody else to understand what your perspective is and to how to get them. If you can't influence them, it doesn't matter. It just doesn't matter, right? Because we're all in the world, we're trying to induce some level of change, right? We're trying to change something, okay? So what this book, teaches you is they lay out a bunch of different word tracks where they say, look, here are some ways in which you might approach the situation. They use a couple of examples, which people are complete opposites of the table around some very serious, like, cultural issues, even people from, that have been involved in war, et cetera. And they say, look, there's commonality here and you guys just don't know it, right? I'm going to help you sort of find it. And once you find, common ground, all of a sudden there's a clearing and an opportunity for two people to get on the same page and to start listening to one another with empathy, right? And so, if you ever find yourself in a disagreement with another coworker, colleague, friend, et cetera, the best thing you can do is just seek to understand and be curious about their perspective, right? And just keep asking questions until you feel like you understand before you even come back and talk about whatever your ideas or wherever you have disagreement, et cetera. And it sounds so simple. The problem is we miss, we don't always have the language or the techniques or the talk tracks to really sort of make that successful.
Yeah, you talked right there. You made a great point about listening with empathy. Patrick, how do we do that? Because most of the time it comes in one year, it goes out the other year. I think a lot of us struggle with active listening, and sometimes that creates problems in the workplace. Sometimes that creates problems in your personal life. So how can we listen with empathy?
Well, in my experience, where people get it wrong mostly is they try to solve a problem too quickly, right? So, and I do this with my wife too. If somebody comes to you and they're just downloading to you, right? They're just kind of they're giving you their problem, their woe, whatever the thing is. I want to race to solve that problem. Oh, have you tried this? Have you tried that? What about this? What about that? Right? I start analyzing it, right? Making it intellectual, I think I'm being helpful. And it turns out that that's not empathy, right? Empathy is not saying anything, right? And just sort of like literally listening to what the person is saying. And in some ways, if you have a problem relating, sometimes if you're not, naturally empathetic, you should literally in your mind visualize what it's like to be in that person's shoes, having gone through that thing that she or he is describing to you. Like, what if that thing happened to you? How would you feel about that, right? You need to kind of channel that. And then you need to be able to reply in such a way that is empathetic, right? You might feel empathetic, but maybe you haven't actually shown that. You haven't given any language to it, right? So you might say, "Oh, babe, that's terrible. I'm sorry to hear that. Like, how, I don't know if I could have even dealt with a situation like that, right?" If you haven't related to it, then you have not shown any empathy, right? And so sometimes people just want you to sit in the mud with them. Just sit in the mud with them, right? They want a companion, and then that alone, that kind of company, you'll find that goes a long way in having to kind of remedy the issue at hand.
Yeah, no, I really like that answer, and I truly agree with you on the points that you made there. And so, like, how do we actively seek feedback from others to improve? I want to go back to the leadership. How do we seek feedback to improve our leadership styles? Because I view, like, as you were talking about, you want to be a leader. I want to be a leader. I want other people to be a leader. So how can we do that?
This is maybe the best question, right? A great question here, right? Because, we as leaders are, and by the way, let me step back for a moment. You don't have to be in a position of authority to be a leader, by the way, right? So you don't have to manage people to be a leader. So managers and leaders, I mean, those are two completely different things. If people get promoted into positions, they become managers of people. We hope they're great leaders. They might not yet be good leaders. They might not have right? They're learning on the job what it's like to become a good leader. You could have somebody that doesn't manage people, and they actually are more naturally inclined as a leader, right? If you were there for somebody else, be it a peer or a colleague or a friend or whatever, you are demonstrating leadership attributes, right? So that's an important distinction, number one. So going back to your question, so something leaders don't do often enough is they don't practice self-awareness, okay? Because, in the old days, it was very autocratic, right? It was like, oh, I manage people, I'm the boss, I will dictate to you and you will do as I say. Okay. So then why is there a need there for self-awareness? Because, but what we've learned over time is that people who follow you because they're inspired to follow you will often do more for you, right? They want you to be successful, right? And so if we're going to inspire them to follow us, then your question is dead on, because we want to optimize how we're leading, right? And one of the ways to do that is to be self-aware around where are our blind spots, where can we improve? So this is a very uncomfortable thing to do, right? But I obviously spend a lot of time giving feedback to my employees, right? How often do I sit down and say to my employee, who, by the way, reports to me, hey, I want to do something that maybe we haven't done before. I would like you to give me feedback. And I'd like to understand, what is something I've done in the last, call it 30 days, that you can recall that you really enjoyed, that I should continue to do, right? Or do more of, maybe, right? So now I'm asking for positive feedback, because I want to kind of lay the groundwork for the thing I'm going to ask next, which is negative feedback or constructive feedback, right? So, I really appreciated when you acknowledged my contribution to this project that we were working on, 3 weeks ago. That made me feel really good. And, I wish I could receive more recognition, et cetera. Cool. Great. So let me ask you, what's something I did in the last 30 days that you didn't quite enjoy as much, right? Or maybe something you think I could do better, or something I didn't do that you think I should have done, right? And now I've laid that groundwork to hopefully, get an honest answer from that employee, right? So I can be better. And as long as I built psychological safety, which is, by the way, one of the core tenets of a framework, which I could talk about with you in a moment. But psychological safety, if I built that in my culture and in my environment, so my employees can feel like they can be honest with me and they can say something, even though it sort of might be about me, and they're not going to be reprimanded for that in any way or treated differently. And in fact, they know that I want to hear that. And sometimes I actually encourage a dissenting opinion, or sometimes I encourage critical feedback on myself. Then I'm going to hear those things. And it's going to create awareness around my blind spots. And I'm going to be a better leader because of it.
Yeah, I really like the blind spots thing because I think I don't know, I struggle with this perfectionism thing where I feel like I need to be so well at everything, but then sometimes when you are that type, you forget about certain areas or aspects and those create blind spots. So I like that point that you brought up there. And another thing that I wanted to ask you, Patrick, today is like when we're talking about like we've been talking about communication, we talked about leadership, all of those, you know, create this thing that I want to call growth, because obviously you want to grow and develop yourself as a leader. So where did you grow and develop yourself the most as a leader? Did it come from learning from other people? Did it come just from throwing into the fire? Where did that come from for you?
Yeah, I mean, my growth, I think, was mostly a result of personal reflection. This is, by the way, an opinion I have about a lot of things. Is there's so much information that you can get out into the world. There's so many books you can read, so many videos you can watch, right? Almost on every topic, including leadership.
Yeah.
But where you end up growing the most is just by getting out in the field and doing the work and trying it, right? And kind of like learning what works and what doesn't work, right? And you want to be careful about following the advice of people that are too theoretical and that they're not actually running businesses or doing the thing, right? Most of my growth came from actually starting a company, hiring people, right? Managing those people to metrics, seeing where they succeeded, where they didn't, what works, what didn't, right? We have quarterly reviews at our company, right? Because I want, a dynamic feedback loop around how, how are things doing, where can we perform, etc. Learning about what works and what doesn't work, and then reflecting on that personally, and then using then other, literature or books or whatever, as a soundboard to reflect on the lessons I've learned, right? Then becomes more valuable because I'm actually doing the thing, right? And that was where I grew the most, right? So if I had not started a business, if I had not put myself in a position to take the risk of leading others, I would, reading books, it just doesn't, it would not have been, would not have had the same level of contribution, is what I'd say.
That's awesome. It's awesome. And for those out there, like Patrick's saying, is go out there and take a risk and give it a try. And Patrick, I've appreciated all the things you've shared today. Most of the answers you gave have been extremely helpful for me. Is there anything on the podcast you feel like we left out today that you'd like to leave the audience with?
Yeah, look, I would just say that leadership is an acquired skill set. When people think of great leaders, they tend to think of very charismatic figures, right? Boisterous figures that can command a room. Sometimes great leaders they can be really introverted, right? And what matters most is that you genuinely care about your people. You want to improve. If you want to improve, you're going to go out and you're going to acquire the skill set to improve, right? And you have to be able to take feedback seriously. I mean, if you're going to put yourself in a position where you're going to give feedback to others, you need to be willing to take that feedback as well, right? I mean, I think that's pretty critical there. So here's the other thing that I'll share as well, which I think is interesting. So when people start businesses, they normally are thinking about, money, right? Financial success, right? I want to start a business, so I can make X amount of money, I can make my first million, whatever the case is. It turns out that after a while, it's really more about, being of service to others, right? And so having, however you encapsulate that, your purpose statement, your mission statement, your vision statement, however you encapsulate that, etc. But actually being purpose driven and showing up for others has a lot to do with where you actually end up finding fulfillment. And so if I had to sort of rewind the clock, I would have put a little bit more thought into the design of our business kind of around that, as opposed to, just getting out over sort of, looking at the pure play mathematics, the profitability, metrics and things of that nature, right? So I think I would encourage people to think about being of service to others and know that everybody has capacity for leadership.
So if you're ready to grow, hit that subscribe button, drop a comment, and let's build a mindset that empowers and transforms.